everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We are talking about medical device recalls. The word recall often carries a negative connotation at medical device companies, and today we're going to really unpack what a recall truly is and help you navigate that process. Recalls are actually pretty common. Each year, the FDA oversees thousands of medical device recalls. So if you work at a medical device company, it is likely that at some point you're going to have to conduct a recall. And the process is actually a lot less scary than it seems. So today we're going to dive into that. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to mention. First of all, this program is being recorded. So we will be sharing, or we will be able to share the program, the video recording of the program, and it'll be on our YouTube page. Second, the slides that we're going through today can be found under the handouts tab within the GoToWebinar control panel. And finally, we're going to leave time for questions at the end. So if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the questions tab within the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will go through those at the end. All right. So just wanted to first take a minute to introduce Gardner Law for those of you who may not be familiar with our firm. We're an FDA law firm located in Minnesota, and we specialize in regulatory compliance, privacy, and litigation for FDA-regulated industry. We have a team of 10 attorneys and a number of specialists that cover these 4 practice areas. And collectively, we've helped medical device recalled or helped navigate that process, both in-house at companies and then now kind of as an external advisor. So we do have a lot of experience with this process. So we're happy to share some insights today. And just quickly, we'll do some introduction. My name is Amanda Johnston. I'm a partner at Gardner Law. My practice at the firm focuses on FDA regulatory strategy and also healthcare compliance. Previously worked in-house at Medtronic, United Healthcare, and Coloplast. And I currently serve as an adjunct professor of drug and device law. So throughout my career at Coloplast, Medtronic, I've been, very involved in managing recalls, both as in-house, working in-house, but also helping clients through the process now. And joining me today, I have Tim Phillips and David Graham, who each bring a wealth of experience on their own. And I'm going to hand it over to Tim to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, from about 1988 until 2020, so for a little over 32 years, I worked at the Food and Drug Administration in the Minneapolis district office. And while there, I spent the first 12 years as an investigator doing primarily medical device inspections. I have a degree in biomedical engineering, so that was a good fit for my education. Then in the last 20 years of my FDA career, I served as a compliance officer. Then following my retirement in 2020, I've been working as a consultant and specialist for Gardner Law. And I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of St. Thomas, where I teach in the regulatory science program in the School of Engineering there. Now, when I was with FDA, I did a lot of work related to recalls. As an investigator, I regularly conducted recall follow-up inspections, and in fact, I did several inspections whose findings themselves led to recalls. And I also did recall audit checks, which is a kind of a common duty that FDA investigators have that's done to ensure that recipients of recall letters followed instructions in recall notifications. Then as a compliance officer, I worked with recalls from a slightly different angle. I regularly reviewed 806 reports and evaluated on the adequacy of companies' recall letters and recall strategies. I also helped determine whether inspections were necessary to review a company's quality system following a recall. I wrote a number of warning letters to companies that failed to comply with recall requirements. And I also work closely with the Center, CDRH, and FDA's Office of Chief Counsel, and even the Department of Justice in civil and criminal cases that were related to recalls. So I've experienced recalls from many different angles, and I really can't stress enough how important it is for regulatory professionals, no matter what you do, whether you're in quality or legal or whatever, to have a solid working knowledge of this kind of what I think of as like a specialty within a specialty. Because that's really what it is. Knowing when, why, and how to do a recall is a critical part of a company's quality system, and it's a really powerful tool to maintain compliance. So I hope we can improve everyone's understanding of that today. Thanks. David?
Thanks, Tim and Amanda. I am a FDA lawyer, but mostly a litigator. I have done medical device and drug litigation for over 35 years. So I get cases after recalls, and hopefully I can impart today. And I also do False Claims Act cases, product liability cases, all sorts of contract cases, all types of cases that are born out of recalls many times. So hopefully I can give you some insights on things to do and prepare for, and how to keep an eye on the aftermath of a recall to deal with potential litigation that may arise as a result of it.
All right, great. Thanks both. So quickly, I'll go over the agenda. I'm going to start out with some recall basics, talk a little bit about the regulations that govern the recall process, and then I will hand it over to Tim to talk a little bit about FDA expectations, tips and best practices, timelines of what a recall timeline might look like, and then lastly, David will discuss litigation issues with recalls. So with that, we will dive right in. Like I said at the beginning, a lot of companies are afraid of talking about recalls. They think it sounds like something bad. There's definitely a negative connotation associated with it. And I think it comes like, if your lettuce is recalled, you throw it away. But under the FDA's definitions for medical device recalls, it actually covers both removals and corrections. So meaning it's not necessarily about removing devices off the shelves. It can also, under the umbrella of recall, can also include correcting very specific issues about the product. So what is a recall? This is from the definitions. It is a manufacturer's removal or correction of a marketed product that the FDA considers to be violative of the FDA regulations. So in this case, it would be misbranded or adulterated, and against which the FDA could otherwise initiate legal action, like a seizure action. The definition of recall states that it does not include market withdrawals or stock recovery, and we'll talk a little bit about what those mean. But again, kind of digging into the definition, we have removal and correction. Removal is the physical removal of a device from its point of use to another location, and that would be for repair, modification, labeling, relabeling, inspection. Whereas correction is not physically removing the product, but doing something else to correct it. So either repair, modifying, adjusting, relabeling, destroying would also would be a potential here, or just inspection. So a recall does not include, like I mentioned, a stock recovery. So that is if it's still in the control of the manufacturer, the device is on the premises, and you discover that something is, maybe it doesn't meet spec, or it's adulterated or misbranded otherwise. So those actions, if they're still in your control and it meets the definition of a stock recovery, that's not a recall. And then market withdrawal is also excluded, and that is the removal or correction of a product that involves a minor violation that would not be subject to legal action by FDA or would have no violation. So if you have a normal stock rotation practice where you kind of rotate, so you're having kind of the newer or the ones that expire first, that kind of thing, those activities, routine equipment adjustments and repairs, those would not be considered a recall. So just at a high level, again, there's the umbrella term of recall. So the corrective action could be as simple as providing corrected labeling, for example, so that would be under correction, or it could be more complicated or complex where you are physically removing the products from hospital shelves, having to do a design change. And again, depending on the nature of the violation and the associated risks to patients or users, that kind of dictates what the corrective action should be for a recall. All right, so The vast majority of all recalls are voluntary. So that means the manufacturer chooses to take action. It's really rare, but FDA does have authority to force a recall. I don't even know, maybe Tim, if you even remember how many, maybe only a handful ever, I'm not sure. Feel free to jump in if you know.
Yeah, no, I don't have the metrics on that, but you're absolutely correct to say that the vast majority, in the
Yeah.
high 90% at least, are voluntary recalls.
Yep. Okay, great. So voluntary recalls are outlined in the CFR. It's 21 CFR 7. So this, I'm not going to go through the entire regulation, but it really outlines how FDA monitors, how they evaluate recalls to ensure that they're effectively executed. It also outlines the recall classification system. We're going to talk about that in a couple minutes. And then it walks through the recall strategy that the company develops and executes on, including whether there's a communication plan, if there's going to be product retrievals or modifications made. And that recall strategy also discusses corrective actions. And ultimately, the FDA reviews and approves the strategy, oversees the implementation of the recall, and monitors those effectiveness checks, which Tim will talk about in a little bit here. So the process concludes, so the voluntary recall ends when the FDA determines that all reasonable efforts have been made to address the issue. And we'll talk a little bit more about termination shortly. And then another thing to note just from this section of the CFR, the FDA does have authority to publish recall information or issue press releases for significant recalls to protect the public health. So that's part of their purview overseeing medical device recalls. All right, so the FDA requires that manufacturers report certain types of recalls. So under 21 CFR 806, manufacturers are required to make a report to the FDA of any correction or removal if the correction or removal was initiated to reduce a risk to health posed by the device or to remedy a violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act caused by the device, which may present a risk to health. So we have a little bit of a circular argument here, but how it breaks down is if the activity, whether it's a correction or removal, is being done to reduce a risk to health posed by the device, then it's something that must be reported to FDA within 10 working days from the date that the firm initiates that correction or removal. So as you can imagine, there will be some recalls that do not meet that threshold and would not need to be reported under that under 21 CFR 806. But any of them that are initiated to reduce the risk to health would be reportable to the FDA within that 10 working days requirement. I won't go through everything that you would need to report. FDA has some great resources that we're going to talk about a little later here, but it's basic information about the firm and the contact information, device details, a description of the issue, corrective removal actions, any MDR numbers if there were injuries or illnesses associated with it. They're also looking for information about the number of devices that have been affected. Is it a couple or is it whole lots of product? And distribution details, where they are, anything that would be relevant to help FDA understand the scope and then the risk to health posed by the issue. You'll also be wanting to provide a copy of the communication that you intend to send, whether it's to the healthcare provider or end user or both. And then having kind of a plan to continue communication to proceed with the recall process. And you can report via email. There's a division recall coordinator. There's a list online with email addresses. Or you can submit via FDA's e-submitter, so their electronic submission gateway. And if you are not, I think I mentioned this already, but the important piece here is if you are not required to report the recall to FDA under 806, you do want to still keep records of those corrections and removals that did not require to be reported. All right. So once you report a recall to FDA, an evaluation of the health hazard presented by a product being recalled or considered for recall is conducted by FDA to determine really the recall classification. And so this is a tool used by FDA, but we also encourage companies to adopt a similar process that aligns with really FDA's HHE process, because that will help you determine if a recall is needed, and then it will also help guide the recall strategy. So yeah, again, this is a great tool for manufacturers to use. I think FDA even has some resources on its website. It really kind of aligns the manufacturers with FDA expectations. So when you're thinking about kind of all the different harms that could result and the relative degree of the health hazard, this is what FDA is looking to do when they are classifying the recall, so deciding whether it's class 1, 2, or 3. So always recommend that companies have a similar health hazard evaluation or assessment process that aligns. All right, and recalls, as I mentioned, they're classified into a numerical designation. It's what class 1, 2, or 3, similar to the types of device classes, although here it is flipped, where class 1 is kind of the most serious type of a recall, and with device classification, otherwise, usually class 1 is the 510K exempt types of products. But essentially, so it's important to note that FDA makes this classification. Companies can propose a classification, and using that HHE process, they could provide supporting information to try to justify why they believe it would be a 2 or 3, for example, or a 3 most likely, but FDA is ultimately the one that decides what class of recall it is. So again, class 1, reasonable probability of serious adverse health consequences or death. Class 2 would be temporary or medically reversible health consequences, or a remote probability of the class 1 serious adverse health or death. And then class 3 is really not likely to cause adverse health consequences. So again, those are the ones that are typically not reportable. The definition of risk to health under the reportability assessment does align with the definitions of the class 1 and 2 recalls. So typically reports are required for class 1 and class 2 recalls, but not class 3. But again, the classification comes after the reportability. So you do have to make sure that you are looking at the definition of risk to health when you're making that reportability determination, not using the definitions of the recall classifications. It's a little tricky, gets a little complicated. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Tim to talk a little bit about what a recall timeline looks like, and then go into a little bit more detail on the process, the FDA recall process.
Thanks, Amanda. Now, Amanda got us off to a really good start in understanding what a recall is. Now let's look at kind of an imaginary scenario with what I'll just call a typical timeline for recall action. Please don't look at these numbers like, oh, well, that's when all of this stuff has to happen. That's not what we intend here at all. The timeframes that are put in here are just illustrate, I guess, the urgency with which a company probably wants to deal with these issues. And if there are, deadlines within here that are really important, I'll try to point those out as we go through here. So we begin with identification of a potential issue that might warrant a recall. Maybe a series of complaints or product failures or adverse events or even some internal quality control or quality assurance testing that reveals a potential product performance issue. We'll call that day 0. And let's presume that you have a good quality system that requires that product performance issues like you're dealing with be given a health hazard evaluation. That would be a good idea and probably an integral part of most people's quality systems. Let's also assume that your HHE procedures include a mechanism for deciding whether a recall is necessary. Also a good idea and something that's necessary in a good quality system. Now in our timeline, we'll allocate 3 days to conduct that HHE. You'll probably need input from quality, engineering, some medical type input from healthcare professionals who are knowledgeable about the situation that you're dealing with, regulatory folks, plus whatever other specialties you feel like you need in order to get a complete picture of what's going on and what to do about it. But although it's not on the slide, you know, day 4, you'll look, everybody's probably going, well, what happened to day 4? What I'm going to say about day 4 is that we're just going to account for kind of some other internal communications and deliberations that inevitably will take place within your company when you're dealing with a product performance problem like this and the possible need to do a field corrective action. But we're going to say that on day 5, by day 5, you've decided to do a recall. The point I really want to make here is that day 5 in our scenario here starts the clock ticking on the 21 CFR 806 requirement to notify FDA within 10 days. Amanda already mentioned that. So that's how FDA has interpreted that, is when you've made the decision and documented the decision internally to do a recall, that starts the clock ticking on that 10-day time frame to notify FDA that you're going to do this field action that involves risk to health. We're going to say days 6 and 7 are used to develop a recall strategy, prepare recall notification, and any other communications, such as the 806 report that you'll have to go to FDA with. Now, those will probably be long, busy, and stressful days 6 and 7. We're going to dedicate days 7 through 10. We're going to budget those for, among other things, for reporting to FDA. And it's important to note that if the recall, again, this little bit just review from what Amanda just talked about, if the recall does involve a risk to health, a report must be submitted to FDA within 10 working days from the time that that correction or removal decision was made internally. So in our scenario here, it'd be day 15. Day 15 would be the absolute latest day that you could, in a compliant fashion, go to FDA and let them know that you're going to do this field action. So that 10-day clock does start when you decide internally to conduct the recall. Be aware too that
Tim,
after
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
What happens when companies are late, as I know they are, on the notice time?
On the notice to FDA.
What does FDA do if they don't notify within 10 working days?
Well, if they don't notify within 10 working days, that just opens a company up to the sort of scrutiny that could result in a 483 observation or perhaps even a warning letter. And you know, like any other compliance situation that FDA deals with, they'll consider all the factors associated. You know, if you're late by a day or 2 days or 3 days, well, that's one thing. If you're late by 3 weeks, or if, you know, absolute worst case scenario, you don't ever report the action to FDA until they find out about it themselves, then of course the seriousness of that situation and the likelihood that you get a 483 and perhaps even a warning letter would increase.
Okay, thanks.
So I also want to, you know, this is a good time to talk about the fact that after you've contacted the FDA, and again, remember in our imaginary scenario here, you did that at some point between days 7 and 10. After contacting the FDA, expect to hear from an FDA recall coordinator, which is like a field person, works in, right now, the agency calls the field force their Office of Investigations and Inspections. So it'll be a recall coordinator, perhaps somebody from CDRH who's already on the FDA team that's handling the recall, but they'll likely request more information about the device, your recall strategy, the results of your health hazard evaluation, maybe the data that you put together to support the HHE. So when you go to FDA and open up that dialogue, be ready to provide a complete and perhaps even more information than you initially provided, and be ready to do it in a timely and very effective manner. Also on days 7 through 10 in our imaginary scenario here, presumably after you've gotten a thumbs up from FDA on your recall strategy, you initiate the recall by sending your recall letter and any other recall related communications. So in our scenario here, we budgeted 3 days for getting those notifications out. Your post-recall work will be done on days 10 and beyond. And you may say, well, how far beyond? Well, that's really going to vary. For a simple recall involving not many devices and a pretty, you know, perhaps a pretty easy fix, maybe we're talking days. We might be talking weeks. In some of the more complex recalls that I was involved in when I was with the agency, I saw that work kind of stretch out even into a year or two. Now that post-recall work includes effectiveness checks that are done by the recalling firm to make sure that customers received the recall notice and did everything that they needed to in order to comply with the instructions. There'll be recall status reports too that are required, need to be sent regularly to the FDA in order to demonstrate to them that you're making progress on the recall. Only after all recall activities are complete is it reasonable for a company to go to the FDA and request termination of the recall. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We'll shift our focus a little bit to a summary of FDA's internal recall process to get an idea of what the agency does with a recall. First, the agency becomes aware of the recall. And how do they do that? Well, often nowadays it's via an 806 report, the reports that are required by law and regulation that ensure, hopefully, that FDA learns about these field corrective actions. If there is no 806 report, there are other ways that FDA can and does learn about recalls. They'll learn about them through inspections, because that's a common area of coverage for FDA inspections to look at what field corrective actions, if any, have been done and whether or not they were reported to the agency. Complaints, the agency gets complaints from healthcare providers or from competitors even. If a competitor gets wind that you've done a field corrective action and they believe that you haven't gone to the FDA with it and it hasn't been properly publicized, they might come to the FDA and say, hey, guess what's going on with our competitor? News articles, or even internal whistleblowers have been known to come to the agency and let them know about a field corrective action. FDA will review and comment on a company's recall notification and strategy. I'll say this, ideally, the agency prefers to weigh in on the recall letter and strategy before the recall communications go out. And if the agency reviews the letter and strategy after the recall has been initiated, I think the risk that a company runs is that the agency might find it deficient in some way and ask or even require a company to do more or do it differently. A recall coordinator, this is part of the process too, a recall coordinator, as I mentioned before, in the Office of Inspections and Investigations, that's FDA's field force, formerly known as ORA, they're going to prepare information for review by CDRH. And that information that's prepared will include a classification recommendation. So that's really the first point in the process in FDA where that classification decision starts to be made. So this is a really good time if you are concerned about how the agency might perceive and classify your recall. This would be a really good time to open up a dialogue with the recall coordinator and perhaps even the folks in the center, if you know that there are folks in the center that are involved, to kind of get your position in regarding the relative risk of what you're dealing with. Now with CDRH now involved, FDA will go through their process and formalize the recall by reviewing all the information that you've provided, doing their own health hazard evaluation or health risk assessment if it's necessary, and then they'll classify the recall. And at that point then, you'll be notified by the agency of the recall classification. Next slide. FDA will publish recall information on their website and in the enforcement report. And the agency themselves might even do their own press release for a Class 1 recall and some of the more significant, more wide-reaching or important Class 2 recalls. Agency will do a press release for those two. I don't know if people have paid attention, but recently there's, I think, been an increased effort on the part of the agency to get out there earlier and with more complete information when they find out that companies are doing recalls. I think that's come about because there's been some scrutiny on directed at the agency about whether or not they're kind of living up to the congressional expectations of doing a good job of learning about and monitoring recalls. So you might see more of that, more communication and earlier communication from the FDA about recalls. FDA does provide recall information to other federal and government agencies. They do that for a number of different reasons. It might help government agencies and bodies that are purchasing products, might help them with purchasing decisions. And FDA will monitor and audit a recall themselves to ensure its effectiveness. And that's when the agency will actually send their own investigators out, either to do an in-person visit or perhaps contact your consignees to do what are referred to as recall audit checks to evaluate whether or not a company, number one, received the recall letter and notification, and then secondarily, of course, whether they followed the instructions to return product or set it up for in place correction or whatever the field action demands. Then when the action is complete, FDA will terminate the recall and provide a written notification to the recalling firm. Next slide. Few tips and kind of best practices for you. First, we highly recommend that you develop internal policies and procedures for conducting recalls. That's an integral part of a good quality system. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you are trying to figure out the best way internally to do this work while you're dealing with a product performance problem. So have all that stuff set up. Good policy, good complete procedures, an understanding of who's going to work on it, an understanding of the timelines that you expect to meet. Get that done before you're faced with a situation where you have a product performance problem and you want to react in a timely way. Gardner Law, it's in a news drop down on their website, has a really nice write-up there on planning for and conducting a recall. So I would really, and I think that's a link here on the materials that'll take you right to that information. I highly suggest that you look at that following our webinar or at some point in the near future. Another thing that I recommend is that customers and FDA need to be well informed of the recall and the possible risks, as well as given complete instructions for correction. Now that might seem obvious, but folks, I got to tell you, I dealt with an awful lot of situations in the past where companies, for whatever reason, I don't know why, but intended, almost intentionally it seemed like, or maybe in some cases it wasn't intentional, but yet the information that was provided to the agency was vague. Information that was provided to customers was vague or perhaps even somewhat evasive about what was going on. And I'll tell you what, if you're vague or withhold information, that's going to raise red flags. It'll raise red flags with your customers and it'll raise red flags with the agency. It's very important that you be prepared when you bring the issue to FDA. Okay? An example of not being prepared, I dealt with a recall situation one time when I was with the agency where a company called, asked for a meeting, and they came into the office, had 3 or 4 people in tow with a lot of information, and they practically dropped the problem on a conference room table, explained it to us, and then said, so FDA, what do you think we should do? And I still remember kind of being taken aback by that question. I was part of me was kind of flattered, I guess, that the company thought that we and the FDA were smart enough to help them. But I think more so, I was concerned that this company lacked the resources and the expertise to do the work themselves. So, it's kind of a sub part of this tip. I would really recommend that when you go to the agency, be ready to demonstrate your competence and your confidence that you have a good understanding of what's going on with your product and the best way to fix it and the best way to communicate with both the agency and your customers. Please do not ever expect FDA to become a part of your system to help you detect and assess. And I'll just say it this way. If FDA ends up having to do that through an inspection or the receipt of MDR reports or getting information via complaints or a whistleblower, then a company will almost certainly face extra scrutiny of their quality system. Next slide. Along the same lines here, as I mentioned before, don't try to downplay or minimize the problem in the description to FDA or in the notification to customers, and don't try to hide a recall in a document that is not properly titled. And I saw that a number of times over the course of my career, where an actual what constituted a recall action was a company tried to do it in a document titled a technical bulletin or a product information brief or some other similar communication, which doesn't really isn't really designed to cause the level of concern and alarm that a recall should. So, and similarly, don't ever try to conduct a recall quietly or secretly behind the scenes. That's a recipe for trouble with both your customers and with regulatory authorities. And finally, I would suggest that the amount, the quality, and the timeliness of the information that you provide to FDA absolutely affects their decision on whether or not they will conduct a follow-up inspection. Okay, and if you do a respectable job, you might be able to avoid the additional scrutiny of an on-site inspection following a field corrective action. Next slide. Amanda mentioned, and here they are right here, some very good resources that exist on the FDA website. That first link there to a page that deals with recalls, corrections, and removals is a real nice, almost clearinghouse for a lot of the issues associated with recalls. The next bullet there on reporting, that gives you links to the two ways that you can go to FDA with a recall action, the e-submitter mode, or the other link will give you email addresses for the FDA recall coordinators, and you can contact them directly with the 806 information. A lot of people aren't aware of it, but FDA has a model recall letter and a response form. And they also have materials that will help you figure out the best way to do effectiveness checks. And that's all available right on the FDA website.
Thanks, Tim. Somebody had asked a question, and I just wanted to pop in just because it's related to these forms.
Okay.
But a question came in about whether there's an HHE template that companies can use. And there is actually a website, or it's on the FDA website. There's a health hazard evaluation, like a model template form that you can use and adapt. But yeah, so there are lots of resources out there. So I encourage you guys to, be familiar with this first bullet on here is particularly helpful. I think it really walks you through the process quite clearly. All right. And with that, we'll pass it over to David to talk about litigation issues with recalls. David, are you there?
There we go.
There you are.
I don't know what happened. Anyways, the agenda is to talk about the types of recalls, talk about contract disputes to recover costs that often get forgotten, product liability claims, shareholder investor suits, and I want to add to this list a little bit the criminal complaints that can arise out of recalls that are really bad, and also OIG scrutiny where there might be reimbursement issues because a device did not do what it was supposed to do and was paid for by the government. So we'll talk about that as we go and mix it in. So what happens with a recall? Tim expertly explained that information suddenly is public. So you might be in a firm that has not had a recall. You communicate with doctors, you communicate with patients, you communicate with shareholders, and things might be in the public if there's stock issues, or they might be in the public somehow in the news related to the launch of a device or something like that. But generally what you do is not public. Not that people might not be able to find out, but it's just not information that's readily available unless you had a reason to look. When a recall occurs, suddenly you're telling FDA lots of things about your company and your product and your processes that you might not have told before, even though they did inspections, but in much more detail and with much more scrutiny. The government's publicizing things about the recall. And so suddenly your company business is not so private anymore. And that brings eyes and ears to your company and the source of the problem that gave rise to the recall. So that alerts lawyers who might want to advertise for people who might be using your product and say that if you've been injured by that product, you should call them. And patients might also reach out to lawyers. You might get an increase in complaints from patients and inquiries from doctors about, what's this about? Now that I think about it, this happened to me, and is that related to the recall? And so the amount of information and communication is all of a sudden increases greatly, and maybe even exponentially than it had before the recall. Shareholders or investors all of a sudden want to know about the value of their investment, if the recall will impact it in a way that will negatively impact their investment. So those can lead to shareholder claims in the future. And so you're going to get questions from them possibly about what is going on. Competitors probably won't contact you, but they'll seek advantages as a result of the recall in their conversations with customers that you both have. And so suddenly competitors might be reporting things to FDA where they might not have before. And obviously you rather tell the FDA about things going on with the recall than have competitors do that. And then of course you'll have an internal analysis of the recall and how to move forward, which may give rise to additional information, certainly that you'll be providing to the FDA, but you might have to provide to people who might want to bring a lawsuit against the company, but it also might give rise to information that is integral to your defense going forward. So as I talk about litigation and talk about the different things that occur or you might do to prepare, don't always think about the story that others are going to be telling about your company. You also have to be thinking about the story you will be telling the public about what happened. And so it's important to keep that in mind and make sure your documentation is consistent with how you document anything in the company, assuming you have a proper document retention policy and have done all your reporting to FDA and other entities that need reports from you, whether it be the SEC or state boards or customers or whatever it might be. So keep that in mind. So suddenly now with a recall, you have an increased need to keep track of communications among people about it and about the company generally. Next slide, please. So, and it's kind of been alluded to in some of Tim's comments about what he sees and doesn't want, what the FDA does not want to see in terms of what information is provided to the FDA to determine if there needs to be a recall, to do the HHE analysis, and ultimately to decide whether it's over. In other words, whether you can terminate the recall. So there's sort of an inherent, I shouldn't say sort of, there is an inherent conflict between getting the recall done properly and possible future litigation and litigation prevention. This is not to say that the number one priority is not patient safety. It's always patient safety. The number two priority in order to enhance and protect patients is clear and transparent communications with FDA and certainly with customers and people that use the devices. and within the company, and especially so that the recall gets done correctly, gets documented correctly, and you're not having to defend in a lawsuit that may arise how you conducted the recall. It's one thing to have to defend the device. In other words, what happened, it precipitated the recall to the device, and what are happening to patients, and all that goes into those types of cases. You don't want to also have, as part of those cases, a recall that reflected a lack of transparency to FDA and customers and to the public. That just makes it worse. Then it's a bad company case, not just a bad device case. And plaintiffs' lawyers will try to make it a bad company case anyway, so you don't want to give them more to do that. So this conflict needs to be not ignored, but also not a driver of bad recall conduct and documentation that might be a problem later when trying to explain to a jury what happened. Next slide, please. I should say also about documentation, you should assume that it's public. Judges will see it, juries will see it. It's not just the FDA. Newspapers might see it, all sorts of different entities that you wouldn't normally think about in the context of your business and whether or not they see information. So things need to be developed and produced in a way that it's honest and transparent, so you don't have to worry about what it looks like and how it's characterized later. So Tim already touched on this, so I'll run through it quickly. You need to develop a recall team. Not only do you have to have as a part of your quality system, you need qualified people that understand the process. They can help you decide the recall. They can help you execute the recall. I'm going to assume that they'll know how to do that, although everybody learns, I'm sure, about every recall they do. And we've all seen, at least on this panel, all sorts of different kinds of recalls and all sorts of mistakes made. Usually not mistakes that lead to FDA action or something, but things that you would want to do better. I want to focus on a communication plan. So you need a recall team that has somebody who understands all the different kind of communications that are going on about the recall to the FDA, to shareholders, to patients, to customers, and can report that and make sure that it's consistent. It's never going to be 100% consistent. And you don't want to whitewash things just to make it consistent. But you have to have somebody, maybe more than one person, who understands the company's ethic and policies about these things that can make sure this is all being done correctly. And if you don't think you can handle it, you should consider a public relations firm, somebody that's been through all these things, but some person or entity that can at least get you going on communication plans that don't cause litigation headaches in the future. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there's going to be a recall analysis done. And this slide is not to tell you how to do a recall analysis. It says that you need to do them in a way that not only deals with all the requirements of the FDA, but also looks down the supply chain, up and down the supply chain, to find out what happened. Did something cause this in the products we use, the materials we use, and things like that, that not only will allow us to make the corrective actions that we need to make, but will also allow us to seek indemnification if it's needed in the future. Obviously, indemnification about costs does not supersede making sure patients are safe and doing the recall correctly. But it's important that as you're going to have somebody working that part of the documentation and analysis to see if, what happened, do we need new suppliers, who are those suppliers going to be, and ultimately who's going to pay at the end of the day. So I get involved in a lot of recalls after they have happened, where everybody's deciding who pays for what. Now, ultimately, the company that makes the product pays, right? But if it's some other issue that's occurred with a vendor or a supplier, then that needs to be analyzed. So how do you do that? Well, you have to analyze what your damages are, right? Somebody has to calculate the cost of the company of doing the recall. So that might take some forensic analysis, but it also, you'd be surprised how many companies have an incredibly difficult time determining what the cost was. They have legal costs, certainly, and they have, costs, the burdens and the extra time that people have to put in to completing the recall. But there are a lot of damages that you should, in advance, be prepared to calculate. What do the contracts say? Somebody should be looking at that with the suppliers and vendors, so you can tell what kind of position you might have to recover costs. Should do a legal analysis depending on what state you're in, not just obviously the analysis of doing the recall and the requirements of the FDA, but what will happen when you seek damages from people in terms of the different state laws and things like that that might be impacted. And then insurance policies and what's the available coverage. Hopefully you have a recall insurance. Some companies don't, but hopefully you have insurance and the recall will be covered by that insurance. But you have to have somebody that understands that and can do the analysis of that for you and come to a determination about that. Next slide. And finally, and I will be done with a few parting tips. You might need a post-recall team, one, to do all that I've done, two, to make sure that once you have approval to end the recall from the FDA, you continue to analyze the things we've just discussed about who's going to pay for what and how to prevent it in the future. Once you get that release from FDA, release is not the correct legal term, but that the recall's been terminated, people relax a lot, and they should. I mean, they accomplished a lot and hopefully protected people and protected the company, but you need a group of people to keep analyzing what happened, keep looking for ways to protect the company if there's lawsuits coming in, and have experts available, whether they be statisticians, experts on the particular mode of failure that occurred with the particular device. Legal counsel, certainly, if you don't have in-house counsel, somebody that's been through this and can help you organize the company's documents and other things to that's consistent with the document retention policy and that can help you deal with potential lawsuits as they might come in. Then you need an executive decision maker who doesn't take their eye off the ball also after the FDA tells you you're done. You need somebody engaged with shareholders, about the recall, and you're doing all the preventative work you can do as it relates to potential litigation. So with that, one more thing I want to say, don't forget about payers, right? Payers all of a sudden might come to your door and say, hey, wait, we paid for those and now they need a new one, or it didn't work, we didn't get the benefit of the bargain, and that payer might be the government. And so you need somebody to deal with potential claims there related to reimbursing the government. I am going to stop there because I see that we have 5 minutes left and we want to leave time for questions.
Awesome. All right. Yes. Thank you, David. Thank you, Tim. We do have some questions, so I will read them and then I'll take a stab and then I'll pass it over to whoever would be the best here. So the first one is, oh, I just skipped it again. Okay, so would you conduct an HHE for every issue you come across or to a collection of issues you are analyzing? So I think this kind of gets at what point do you do kind of the HRA, HHE assessment? it should be written into your processes and policies in terms of what would trigger kind of that field action assessment. But it will come up if there's a product issue that could have a potential risk to patients. I don't know, Tim, if you have anything to add.
No, I think you hit on it there. I think that that question hopefully can be answered by the detail that's written into your quality system and the procedures that define when it is that an issue becomes eligible, so to
Right.
speak, for additional review and scrutiny via an HHE. And whether issues, I think a lot of times, whether to deal with dealing with multiple issues at one time, which is kind of what I took from that question, dealing with multiple issues at one time in an HHE kind of tends to kind of cloud things. So I think the greater amount of specificity you can provide to what you're looking at is probably better.
Yep, agreed. It often comes up if there's something out of spec in manufacturing, if you have a supplier issue where you're, seeing the incoming inspection, you're noticing something out of spec, if you're getting a lot of complaints, and trending and watching those trends from like an MDR complaint handling perspective. But yeah, I agree. It should be outlined in advance in your quality system so that you don't have to kind of guess every time something happens, whether you need to trigger that field action assessment. It may be a CAPA or an NCMR or something otherwise as well. All right.
I'm going to
Next
just
question.
add one thing on that.
Yes, please do.
Not that analysis is an important, you shouldn't do them all the time. But if you get a feeling in your stomach that, boy, this has been around a while, that means you should do something, right? It's because in litigation, it's what happened, when did you know about it, and what did you do about it?
Right.
And so I don't mean to be an alarmist about it because that's not helpful either to companies or the public. But keep that in mind.
And
Yep.
that's absolutely true. I think from the standpoint of what the FDA is going to look at, whether it's an investigator or whoever from the agency is looking at a problem, the longer that problem has been around and continues to exist, and if it's increasing too in frequency or severity, that's going to raise red flags with the agency.
Yep. Thank you. Okay. I know we'll just have a couple minutes left. I'll try to go through a lot of these quickly. So when a recall is conducted late, are you saying FDA could issue a 483 or even a warning letter if found years after the event during an inspection, or would that FDA enforcement action occur at the time of the recall information being provided to the agency? And I think, Tim, this is probably based on what your comments were, but I think potentially, yes, they could discover it years later, and it would probably be something like insufficient recall policies and procedures in place. I don't know if you have any comments on that one.
No, I think like if what a company failed to do was notify the FDA about a field corrective action, then I think as soon as the agency discovers that a company failed to notify them about a field corrective action, even if it was done, 3, 4, 6, 8 months ago, the company still could face scrutiny in the form of a 483 observation or a warning letter because they failed to comply with 21 CFR 806.
Right.
Hopefully that got to the question.
Yep, I think so. Okay, next one. I understand it is recommended to wait for FDA recall assessment and review of proposed recall communications before sending it out. With that in mind, is there a guaranteed review time from the FDA to ensure that the recall can be initiated and communicated properly or promptly, especially for class 1?
You want me to take that one?
Yeah. I don't think there's a guaranteed review time, but maybe you can speak to kind of how FDA treats that.
Yeah. No, there is no, that I'm aware of, guaranteed review time. I think the agency, though, it's safe to say, places a very, very high priority on their work in this area. And if a company comes to them and says, hey, FDA, we've got this problem and we're ready to go to the field on it, and we have a draft recall letter here, and we have most or all of our 806 information that we're ready to provide to you, can you look at it? Can you look at it now, and can you get back to us as quickly as possible? The agency will prioritize that work and hopefully get back to you quickly in in hours, hopefully, perhaps a day or two. And I do understand that is one of from the experience that I've had both with the agency and now outside the agency in helping clients at Gardner Law. I understand that there are pros and cons to whether or not you go to the agency before you before you initiate a field corrective action or not. And I know that some companies, if they're confident in what they're doing, that they've fully addressed the issue, their recall letter is good, they know what they need to do down the road, they're certain that their strategy is solid and FDA is going to agree with it, they'll do that and then notify the agency just within their 10-day 806 timeframe, and then they just kind of take their chances that the agency agrees that their strategy is good and their letter's complete. So I understand there are two sides to that, some pros and cons to whether or not you go to the agency before or after you send the letter.
Yep. And then we got another question that was similar to that. So I will skip over that one. Our customers and devices are limited, so we tend to do a software update whenever we receive an issue. So should every software update be considered a correction and hence a recall? And I think the answer is no, not necessarily. You would have to do, again, the assessment to determine whether that correction is being, like the reason for it being done, and do that kind of HRA assessment to determine whether it's reportable or not. I don't know, Tim, if you have any other comments. Software is tricky because you can correct something without even notify. You can do an over-the-air update, so that should trigger some sort of an assessment.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the questions to ask, is it an improvement or an advancement in terms of how the software operates, or is it new software, corrected software to address a problem that can lead to a risk to health? And as soon as you get to the point where your answer to that question is yes, we're fixing a bug here that when it happens can lead to a risk to health, that's when you're getting into the realm of likely having the need to do a correction removal and let FDA know about it.
Okay, thank you. Two more, we'll get through them quick. Have any of you done a self-disclosure to the DOJ in connection with a device recall? I have not seen that done. I don't know, Tim, if you've ever seen that.
I haven't been involved in, no.
I have. And it's complicated. And the number one rule on self-disclosure is being very specific about what you're disclosing. And because once there will be an investigation, and you want that investigation to be narrow as possible. So tailoring that disclosure and how you do that's very important.
Okay, thank you. Yes, self-disclosure is kind of a double-edged sword, but DOJ is definitely trying to encourage it. And then the last one, this one might be a little bit specific, but is there an official stance on how a recalled product is treated if you're executing a recall on behalf of a foreign manufacturer? So this would be like the initial importer. The OII sometimes says the recalled product may not be sent out of the country to the manufacturer for rework. I don't know, Tim, do you have any thoughts?
Oh, the answer to that does not jump right out at me.
Okay, yeah. I'm not aware of an official stance on it, so I don't know if it's just something that, that's discussed during the recall planning strategy, but. Okay.
I mean, that's absolutely a part of, what FDA does when they review the adequacy of a strategy is they'll look at what a company's plans are for disposition of the
Right.
returned product. And, but I wasn't involved in enough detail in situations involving international
Got it.
business partners, so I can't answer that.
Okay. All right. I know we're 5 minutes over. Thanks to those of you who stuck around. Thank you, Tim and David. Hopefully you learned a lot from this program, and feel free to reach out to us afterwards if you have any questions or want to discuss these topics further. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.